Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our next installment of the Cape Perpetua Speaker Series. Today, we're going to be hearing from Matthew Reilly on climate change, disturbance, and forest change in the Oregon Coast Range. And our next presentation will be Saturday, December 4th, about Cascadia, ready or not, with Althea Rizzo. I want to acknowledge that the Cape Perpetua area landscape that stretches from Yachats to Florence is the traditional territory of the Siletz tribe and the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw tribe. And we want to acknowledge the tribal governments and their roles historically and today in taking care of these lands. A little bit about the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. My name is Tara Du Bois. I'm the communications coordinator for the collaborative. It's an honor to coordinate this series. And the collaborative's vision is to foster conservation within local communities for scientific exchange, management, awareness, and stewardship around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve. And our three guiding principles are community engagement, leveraging resources, and engaging in partnerships. And the logos you see at the bottom here, these are the organizations and agencies that were the founding partners of the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. And in addition to these, we also have a variety of other local business and organization partners. And we truly appreciate working with our partners. It wouldn't be possible without them. Our focus is on the Marine Reserve that stretches from Yachats to Florence. It's Oregon's largest marine reserve. You can see here in the image on the left. The red part is the reserve where there's no take and no ocean development. And then to the north and south of the Marine Reserve, there's also protected areas. And some take is allowed in those. That varies depending on the reserve and still no ocean development. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the management agency of Oregon's marine reserves. And some of these photos here are photos they have taken under the water. So when you take a dive under the water, these are some of the animals that you might see. Sometimes you don't even have to go as far. You can hit the tide pools, as you can see here with the sea stars and the crabs and anemones. So much biodiversity in this region. We host quite a bit of community science at Cape Perpetua. You can see here there's a variety of projects. Most of them are through the spring and summer and or early fall, but we also host monthly beach cleanups year round. And in addition to this speaker series, we host a Young Scientist webinar series where we hear from grad students and postdocs on their ocean research. And that's the second Tuesday of the month, October through April. And you can find out more about all of our events, our speaker presentations, and more about the Marine Reserve and the Collaborative at our website, capeperpetuacollaborative.org. And I always like to encourage folks to connect with us on our Facebook page and our YouTube page as well. And if you'd like to help give back and keep programs like this going, you can feel free to donate. There is a donate button on our website that will take you right where you need to go. And with that, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Matthew Reilly. He is a forest ecologist studying how forests respond to disturbance and climate change. Much of his current work focuses on the historical and contemporary role of fire on landscape in Western Oregon and Washington. He currently works for the USDA Forest Service, Pacific Northwest Research Station, and Western Wildlands Environmental Threat Assessment Center in Corvallis, Oregon. He holds a PhD in forest science from Oregon State University. And with that, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. And while Matt is bringing up his presentation, I just want to let you know that we will do a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to plug your questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end.
Okay. Everyone seeing my screen?
Looks great.
Okay, I'm going to try and just rearrange things a little bit on my end. let's see, from beginning. Okay, there we go. Well, thank you, Tara, very much for that introduction. And thanks everyone for joining this morning. What I'm going to do today is sort of share some highlights from a climate change vulnerability assessment that was done for the Siuslaw National Forest. It's currently kind of in the works. And so the focus of that is a little bit broader, you know, the whole coast range of Oregon. And today I'm going to try and focus a little bit more just on the coastal areas and in particular forests, and how climate change and disturbance have played a major role in structuring them in the past, the present, and into the future. And, you know, I primarily am used to speaking to scientists and forest managers. And so I do, occasionally I have some graphs and things like that, but I don't think there's anything too heavy. And I feel like after COVID and reading the news, everyone has really developed some skills with that. So anyways, but I'll walk folks through those. And if you do have questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them at the end. And so just a quick, let's see. There we go. Yeah, just a quick overview of where we're going to go today. I'm going to give a little bit of historical perspective on vegetation change and disturbance historically. So briefly, we're going to talk about the Holocene, which goes all the way back since glaciation, and then sort of pre-settlement disturbance regimes before European colonizers showed up. Talk a little bit about 20th century climate change and forest dynamics. And then we're going to wrap up with a little bit about where the climate is going in the future and what the implications of that are for forest change in the coast range. And so broadly speaking, the coast range can really be broken up into a couple different major vegetation types. The Sitka spruce, which is dominated primarily by Sitka spruce, really occurs along the coast and is very tightly linked with the occurrence of fog. And then this other major type, which we call Western hemlock, but is really what everybody knows, dominated by Douglas fir. So if you think of an old growth stand dominated by large Douglas fir with Western hemlock underneath, that's really what dominates most of the region towards the inlands away from that fog belt. And if you've ever been up to Mary's Peak, there's a really unique site up there, up towards the top, that's dominated by noble fir, kind of unique for the coast range. And then sort of towards the south and into the interior, we also have some dry forest types dominated by grand fir and Douglas fir, but we're not going to spend as much time on those today. There's also a number of really unique special habitats in the coast range, riparian areas along rivers and streams, meadows, you know, up at Cascade Head, some of those meadows that are up there that have really unique plant communities and are non-forest dominated. Dune systems become more important towards the south, certainly. And then things like tidal marshes and tidal swamps that are going to be very sensitive to changes in sea level and things like that. And so thinking back historically, climate change is really a process that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. And this is, I think, probably one of the heavier graphs that I'm going to show you, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what we know about how the climate and vegetation have changed over the last 12 or 14,000 years during what we call the Holocene period, back after the glaciers receded. And this knowledge comes from these paleo studies. And what scientists do is they go out to places where there's lakes, and they take sediment cores and bring those back to the lab. And what they do is they cut those sediment cores up, and they can date different time periods, and based on the pollen that they find in those, they can recreate what sort of vegetation communities were present thousands of years ago. And the other thing that they look for is the presence of charcoal. And so it's a really neat opportunity at a very coarse scale to look at how climate, fire, and vegetation have changed over the past 10 or 12,000 years. And individually, you can see this map I have here. All those little dots are individual studies. Most of these are studies that Kathy Whitlock, who was a professor at University of Oregon, did with her students. And so a single study may only give you a glimpse of what happened at one place, but when you start putting studies together from across the region, you start seeing this really coherent picture that is consistent across the region and across time periods. And it's a really powerful way to go back in time. And the figure here that I have shows that time, and starting at the bottom, the early Holocene is actually that period right after glaciation, and we are now currently in the late Holocene. But what you can see is after those glaciers receded, it was much, much hotter and drier than it is right now, even under current climate conditions. And then for the next 8,000 years or so, the climate continued to cool and get wetter. And so what you see is during that mid-Holocene is this big transition from forests that were dominated by things like oak and alder, lots of hardwoods back then, to this transition to forests that were more similar to what we have today, dominated by things like Douglas fir and western hemlock and spruce. And there's one published study from the Coast Range from 3 different sites, and it documents similar transitions. And this is from the work of Colin Long, who is a PhD student at University of Oregon. And what I really want to draw attention to is all the way on the left. There's a inferred fire frequency, and these are somewhat complex figures to read, but if we just focus on that, you can see that back around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, fire was far more frequent than it has been throughout the Holocene and is today. And then as the climate cooled through the middle Holocene, fire decreased. And then it continued decreasing even into the late Holocene. And if you look at about 1,500 years ago, there's an uptick in fire. And it's an interesting phenomenon that during this time, the climate actually got cooler and wetter, but fire increased. And this is really evidence, we think, of anthropogenic fire and indigenous cultures burning in the Coast Range there. And so looking back historically, we have multiple factors that are really driving disturbance in vegetation. Moving more recently, the vegetation has been relatively stable for the past couple thousand years. The forest types that we know have been around for quite a while. And thinking about disturbance and, a major catalyst of change, some of the more important agents out there in the Coast Range, we have biotic disturbances. So this would include things like pathogens and insects. These are generally operating pretty much everywhere, but generally, at low severity. They don't often erupt into these large sort of infestations like you might see in dry forests on the east side with lodge pole pond and mountain pine beetle. But they're sort of persistent agents. They're kind of everywhere, and they play a very important role over longer time periods. The other sorts of disturbances are abiotic disturbances, and these tend to leave more of a conspicuous mark on the landscape. So things like wind, certainly fire, and then physical processes like landslides and things like that. And all these disturbances tend to interact. They don't always operate by themselves. And so we want to keep in mind that these things can happen together and sometimes have unique changes. And the Coast Range has a really, really interesting example of that we're going to take a look at. And so in terms of biotic disturbance, some of the major operators, Swiss needlecast is a foliar pathogen. It's become really, really common, I think, since primarily we've started putting Douglas fir plantations really, really close to the coast, where historically it was more western hemlock and Sitka spruce, and those places are now really, really prone to this foliar pathogen, which I think has tripled in occurrence in the past 15 or 20 years. Very, very prominent. It doesn't necessarily kill trees, but it really decreases growth. And so if you're a landowner and your objective is to grow timber and maintain productive forests, this is a major concern. Douglas fir beetle is an insect. Again, it operates primarily on larger Douglas fir, trees greater than, say, 18 inches. And primarily it operates on sort of small clumps of trees. Again, it's not one of these things that really erupts and affects really, really large areas that we've seen. Root and heart rots are things that might persist And over time, sort of decay the roots and weaken trees, slows growth, makes them more prone to snapping or tipping up in windstorms. Balsam woolly Adelgid is important for some of the fir species. I guess primarily grand fir out where y'all are along the coast there. And then things like dwarf mistletoes, which are again, sort of out there and persistent. They don't necessarily kill trees, but they'll decrease productivity. And so we have these biotic disturbance agents that are out there operating. They're generally natural things. We do have some invasive ones, but our forests are adapted to these. And so when we think about how climate is going to change in the future, we want to think about how it might affect these. Winter windstorms, I'm sure you all know, this is a major disturbance out, especially near the coast. And when I think about wind, I think about two types, this sort of chronic and episodic. And so out there by the coast, it seems like the wind is always blowing, and you get up into some of those headlands and you can see the effects of this chronic wind where trees grow much slower, they're dwarfed, they're potentially flagged with their foliage to one side. But we also get these really, really large windstorms that come less frequently and are what I would call episodic. And wind is very much topographically mediated, whether or not you're sheltered by topography or not and how exposed you are. And trees have different tolerances to wind. Certainly bigger trees are more susceptible to getting blown over. They have a lot of foliage and are very, very exposed, but things like Sitka spruce and Douglas fir are also very wind tolerant. Western hemlock is less wind tolerant. And so it's fairly complex in terms of the changes that you might see that might be initiated by wind. And on the bottom right there, I have just a list of some of the historic windstorms that have come through the Coast Range. This is from some research that was done out at Cascade Head. And those, if you look at those peak wind gusts, those are hurricane force winds. Those are really, really serious. And I think the one that sticks out historically is this October 1962 Columbus Day storm. And, the sort of the word there is that, that tree killed more trees than probably the 2020 fires that we had last year. And they may not kill everything in their path, but they affect very, very large areas. And so they can really, really be major agents of change, especially out where y'all are near the coast. I spoke before about disturbance interactions, and there's this really interesting interaction between wind and Douglas fir beetle. And so usually Douglas fir beetle operates just at small scales, a couple trees here and there. But when these wind events, these blowdowns come through, what you'll have is Douglas fir beetle will move in to the dead trees and then spread out to some of the live trees. And so effectively they make these canopy gaps that are created by wind even larger. And here's just a couple pictures of blowdown and subsequent Douglas fir outbreak in the early 1950s. And an old map that I have here, you can see there's a big red patch right there near Waldport. And so these things are infrequent, but they can have lasting and quite large effects that we need to think about in terms of climate change. The next major disturbance agent is fire, and this is something that I study quite a bit and have done a lot of thinking about, especially after the fires last fall or 2 falls ago. But the Coast Range really, despite the fact that it's so wet, has what we call a standard placing fire regime. And if you look at the map I have on the right, it sort of shows the distribution of some of these fire regimes. In an infrequent high severity fire regime, you basically get fires that happen maybe on a centennial basis, so maybe every couple hundred years. But when they do happen, they are large and they're severe. It's very, very different than the historical fire regimes that you might know on the east side if you go over to Sisters, where forests are dominated by these old growth ponderosa pine stands, and historically fires happened every 5 to 25 years, and they were primarily low severity and just killed small trees and maintained an open structure. We have sort of the exact opposite of that on the Coast Range and really much of the west side of Oregon and Washington. And we know this because there are scientists in the past that have gone out and looked at age structure of forests. And so these fires may happen infrequently, but they leave a very long lasting impression on the forests. And if you look at this map that I have here, it's a little old school. This is from the early 90s. Peter Teensma was a graduate student, and what he did was age trees in as many different places as he could in the Oregon Coast Range and put together a story of how forests have changed over time. And what you can see there is in the 1850s, the late 1840s and 1850s were a period of huge fires in the Coast Range, hundreds of thousands of acres, potentially millions of acres. The Yakina fire, all sorts of fires that were probably associated primarily with initial European colonization. And you can see those big dark patches are what he has sort of painted as areas that were recently burned then. The Coast Range is very, very productive and things do recover fast. So by the 1890s, a lot of that had recovered to forest. There were some other fires. 1868 was a big fire year as well. And then by the 1920s, there had been a couple smaller fires, but forests had redeveloped and reached mature status across much of the landscape. And then by the 1940s, you can see a lot of the orange area, the 0 to 49, is probably the result of logging. But there's a big red patch up there that is the result of the Tillamook burns. And so when you zoom out a little bit, you can see how these fires really structure forests at larger spatial scales. And a couple of things we know about these fires, and this was certainly validated in 2020, but they are a normal part of the environment in these wet forests on the west side. And generally there are three major ingredients for these large fires. And the first is ignition. Lightning is very rare on the Coast Range and in the west side in general. And so we think that certainly in the 1800s and historically, people were a really important driver of ignition and still are today. The second thing would be very, very dry conditions. We have a Mediterranean climate here in the Pacific Northwest. So certainly in the interior of the Coast Range, it dries out every year. But there's that fog layer out near the coast that keeps things cooler and wetter even in August and September. And so we think that really unique drought conditions had to have been a factor. And then finally, really the main ingredient, and probably the one that is hardest to predict for us, is these dry east wind events. And we certainly saw that last fall in 2020. And we don't know a whole lot about these dry east wind events because fires are so infrequent on the west side. Most of what we know is really like that figure that I showed you there from Peter Teensma work. It's been recreated. We haven't had very many opportunities to study these disturbances firsthand. And so what we know about these east wind events, this is old science. And what I'm showing you here is basically on the x-axis along the bottom is a time sequence from the summer to the late fall, so from June through October. And on the left side is the number of these dry east wind days. And the way this was made was this fellow, Owen Kramer, who I think was a Forest Service scientist back in the 50s, went up to the Portland airport and harvested all their meteorological data. And what they had been doing for decades up there was sending these weather balloons up into the upper atmosphere that would record things like wind speed and direction and relative humidity. And then they bring them back down at the end of the day and write them down. And he just sort of harvested that data and came up with a threshold for what he called the dry east wind day. And this is basically days when relative humidity is lower than 25%. That's really, really hot and dry. That's about what we saw during the Tillamook burns. And then average wind speeds are above 6 meters per second, which doesn't sound that high, but averaged over time is really, really a strong wind. And when he plotted the frequency of these over time, what you can see is there's this really distinct window of vulnerability. They're very, very rare in the spring and early summer. But about mid-August, their frequency really, really increases rapidly. And what I've done here is I've added the dates of some of the iconic fires that we've had here on the west side. And certainly the Tillamook burn in the Coast Range, late August. The 2020 fires, September 7th to 9th, right in that window, eerily similar to the occurrence of the Yackle burn in Southwest Washington, which burned, I think, over 300,000 acres overnight, another east wind-driven event. The Susan burn was another fire in that neck of the woods up there, Southwest Washington, 1929. And then September 26th, another example from 1936 in Bandon. So this is another Coast Range fire. And so these things are difficult to predict, but we do know seasonally when they are more likely to occur. And so again, the Tillamook fire is really one of our greatest examples of one of these iconic fires, and one of the few that we really have instrumented weather data for and that we can understand. And I have a map here of daily fire spread, and what you can see is that fire started, and fire ecologists like to use this word skunked around, which means it basically just kind of burned here and there and spread slowly, probably flared up a little bit during the day and died down a little at night. And then on the right, we have just a table of daily weather. And if you look at that relative humidity, what you see is that August 25th, 26th, the couple days before there, we saw this really rapid drop in relative humidity down to 20 and 30%, which is well within that threshold from that figure that I just showed you. And then if you look at the wind speeds and direction, about August 21st, and certainly by the 25th and 26th, winds had shifted from the east and picked up to this 25, 35 miles an hour. And, you know, that map on the left really shows about 75% of that fire burned in 2 days. And so that fire really blew up. It's really consistent with what we saw in the 2020 fires in the Western Cascades. And we think this is how fires operated historically. So yeah, sort of a relatively modern example of fires. And another thing we know from the Tillamook burns of that time was that these moist forests may go long periods of time between fires, but once they burn, they are often subject to frequent reburning. And this here is a map of all the fires that followed that initial 1933 fire and the Tillamook burn. I think it was called the 6-year curse or something like that, but we have, I think, five more fires that occurred 6 years pretty frequently after that burn. And this phenomenon, we also saw the Susan burn up there, the Yackle burn up in Southwest Washington. That burn was in 1902. It burned 15 times in the subsequent 40 years. And so what we think happens is that these moist, old, and mature forests, they're actually hard to burn in the absence of one of these dry east wind events. But some of the work that was done after the Tillamook burn, early on, they went out and put temperature sensors out there. And as you may well know, it's a lot hotter and drier out in the middle of a clear cut or in an area that's been recently burned than it is in a dense old growth forest. And so potentially the likelihood of fire changes. And these areas may be more prone to reburning. Yeah, so moving ahead back towards more contemporary times and how the climate is changing now, we're going to sort of shift gears, and I'm going to show you some data heavy, dense figures here, but we're going to walk through them and talk a little bit about how the climate has been changing over the last 100 years. And so 20th century warming, I'm sure everybody is well aware that the climate has been warming. I showed you that figure about dynamics from the Holocene, and we had been cooling for a really long period, but since the early 1900s, we've been warming, and we have very solid instrumented data to show that. And so what I have here is on the top, this is a figure of what we call temperature anomalies. And so again, we have time on the y-axis going back to 1900, I'm sorry, on the x-axis. And then the y-axis, that line that you see there is basically the average temperature throughout that period. And so anytime the line that goes up and down is beneath that, it means it's cooler than average. And anytime it's above that, it means that it's warmer than average. And when you look at that figure, you can see some of those fluctuations over time, you know, the 30s there, the Dust Bowl era. Then we were sort of cooling for a little while and warming again. But since the 1980s, we've been on this warming trend, far greater than the Dust Bowl here in the Pacific Northwest. And I think this figure only goes through 2010, but I'm sure that if we were to extend it through 2020, it would be rising even more. And so we've seen warming over the last 100 years, specifically in the last 30 or 40 years. And the figure I have on the bottom basically breaks those trends up by seasonality. And what we see is that warming has been consistent across seasons. It's been greatest, I think, in the winter and in the fall, particularly in the summer there too. But this warming is consistent across seasons. We are just experiencing a warming climate. We're going to look now at the same sort of figures, but we're going to talk about precipitation. And precipitation over the last 100 years has been far more variable. And we can see again, these anomalies. That Dust Bowl period in the 30s was much drier than average. And then from the 50s to the 1980s, it was actually cooler and wetter. This is associated with a sort of El Nino type phenomenon called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So this longer term climate fluctuation that makes things really cool and moist. And then since then, this only goes again up to 2010, but we've sort of been average. However, if you look at that figure on the bottom, what you see is that those changes have not been even across seasons, and that we've been wetter in the spring, but our summers and falls have been drier. And this is really, really important ecologically because we live in a Mediterranean climate. And those seasonal droughts are really, really important for our forests. And so what we're seeing now, I think, is what I call these ongoing impacts of climate change. And some of these, are a little bit more specific than just temperature and precipitation. And so in the Coast Range, there's recent work that shows that we're seeing decreased coastal clouds and fog. This is really, really important in the coast, especially where y'all are at, right along the coast, because it mitigates that summer drought that happens every year. Heat waves are becoming more common. The heat dome from last summer, in terms of crown scorch, everyone in the world that I work in has been talking about some of the crown scorch that happened from that heat dome. And it's been most apparent, I think, in the Coast Range from what I've heard. And so it's a really, really salient effect of climate change that we're seeing. Other sorts of things, climate fluctuations, global weirding, things are getting hotter and drier, windier, intensified hydrologic regimes, more flooding. All these sorts of things are sort of minor components of climate and weather, but very, very important when we think about local issues and what we might be facing in the future. In terms of how forests have responded to these, one of the more conspicuous things we've seen across the West is increased tree mortality rates in old growth forests. And this is another figure that's showing time on the x-axis and mortality rates over time. And when you look at this, a mortality rate of 1% or 1.5% a year, it doesn't sound that much. But these things like your bank account and interest rates, they compound over time. And so a change in 0.5% per year, certainly 1% per year, can have really, really large effects over time. And so these changing mortality rates are something we're very concerned about in old growth forests. There's also been increased mortality from wind out on the coast. I think wind mortality has increased 6 to 10 times. This was documented in Cascade Head in a study by Mark Harmon and Rob Pabst from 2019. And we've also seen some interesting trends in Douglas Fir Beetle related mortality. And this is, I think, one of my favorite figures to show folks. And again, what you see is time going back to 1950. You'll see each of these arrows represents one of those documented wind events that I showed earlier. And you'll note that there's a lot of correspondence, right, with those wind events and these really, really large outbreaks of Douglas Fir Beetle. It's that disturbance interaction I mentioned earlier. And to me, one of the most interesting things about this figure is that it really suggests that Douglas Fir Beetle has decreased over time. And so we had these huge outbreaks in the 50s and 60s. But it's important to remember that climate's not the only thing that's been changing over time. And I mentioned earlier that Douglas Fir Beetle is more important on larger trees. And so since the 1950s, we've also seen sort of a decrease in habitat for Douglas fir beetle. As logging of old growth increased, there's actually less suitable habitat out there for Douglas fir beetle. And so these wind events may be happening, but the trees that are the appropriate size for Douglas fir beetle may be less common. And so sort of a really interesting story there. And if you zoom in on the dynamics and changes since 1980, you can see we've had some of these bigger wind events, but there's sort of an increasing trend there in Douglas fir beetle activity. And that's probably partially related to hotter, drier summers, weaker trees, more drought stress. But it could also be related that, especially on federal lands, that all those clear cuts are maturing. And so that habitat for Douglas fir beetle is actually becoming more common out there, at least on federal lands. So interesting things to think about. Contemporary wildfires, the Coast Range has not seen the uptick in wildfire activity that the rest of the region has seen, but it has had some fires, and there were fires in 2020, and they were devastating. If you look at most of the fires going back to the 1970s in the Siuslaw National Forest, they're very, very small. These have not coincided with those dry east wind events, fortunately, and we've been able to put them out very, very quickly. The figure below that shows the sources, the causes of fire. And again, lightning makes up a really, really, really small proportion of the fires that happen on the Siuslaw. They are primarily all associated with people, campfires, debris burning, arson, all these sorts of things. And so as the climate changes, whether or not it warms, whether or not these wind events become more frequent, ignition on itself could make fires a more important agent of change. And I mentioned these recent fires, they were not very big. These fires in the Coast Range did not reach the sizes that they did in the Oregon Cascades, but this Echo Mountain complex was devastating. It did not take much to devastate those communities. My understanding of what happened there was that there was an ignition, and it took off, and just burning like that for a day was enough to really devastate those communities. And then the winds died, and it did not reach Tillamook proportions or anything like that, but we have maps of sort of wind speeds during that time period, and had that ignition been in a different place further to the east where the winds were higher, it really could have blown up. And so potentially these are just harbingers to come, and there it's really, fire is going to be a major agent of change. It's tough to say when, but historically we know that they have happened, and it's really, really something that I think needs to be on everyone's radar as we move forward. And so speaking of moving forward, we're going to just dive now into some climate change projections. And I'm going to give everyone a crash course in how climate change projections are done. And what you see here is, again, on the x-axis over time, how things are changing. And this is temperature. And these RCPs are what they're called relative concentration pathways. And what these RCPs represent are different scenarios. They're not necessarily associated with probabilities, but they are plausible scenarios. And the International Panel on Climate Change comes up on these. Basically, they're different scenarios for social change. And so RCP 8.5 is the most extreme. It is basically what scientists project will happen with the climate if we continue with business as usual. If our carbon consumption continues to be at the same rate, this is what they're using as the worst case scenario. RCP 2.6 is sort of based on the idea that global markets change and we become better at sequestering carbon and use less fossil fuels and things like that. So it's really an optimistic change. And reports now are coming out that we're even exceeding RCP 8.5. And so Climate change projections are uncertain. There's a lot of variability, but this is how scientists basically try and rein in that uncertainty. And so we try and use these two business as usual, worst case scenario, and then this really progressive, if we make positive changes as sort of a best case scenario. And what you see here, the way they do this is they spin these climate models up and do what they can to predict past climate change over the last 100 years. And then they project them forward. And what you see here is that under sort of the best case and worst case scenario, increases of temperature up until the 2030 or 2040. And then these situations really, really diverge. And consistent across these different scenarios, we see these increases in temperature. They range anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a lot. It's a lot. I think over the past 100 years, we've been at about 1.8 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase in the Pacific Northwest. And these are the changes that we've seen that I just talked about. So think about 4 times that and what that might mean. And the projections are consistent amongst season, warming across all seasons. When we start thinking about precipitation, things are quite a bit more variable. And again, here, what I have is these are projections for 2071 to 2100, so the end of the season. And on the x-axis, we have these different scenarios and what they predict towards the end of the century. And they all predict basically more precipitation. We are expected to get wetter here in the Pacific Northwest. But when you look at these, even across scenarios, what we see is that most of that change in precipitation, consistent with what we've seen in the past 100 years, things are getting wetter in the spring. So a warmer, wetter spring, but they are getting drier in the summer and fall. And so these trends that we've seen in the last 100 years are really expected to continue on to the future and even intensify. And so cumulatively, when we think about forests, this means that there's less water available for plant growth during the growing season. And this is a map of what we call water balance deficit. And the browner you get, that means you're going to get drier. And the bluer you get, it means you're going to get wetter during the growing season. And this is just one scenario, but it paints a picture of regional variability. And certainly near the coast, the projections are that there might not be as much water balance deficit, as much drought. There may be less of an effect on available water for forests into the future, but it's going to be warmer and drier. And the other thing is that there's been recent science to show that the number of fog-free days has been decreasing. Certainly in California, there's been a huge decrease. I think since 1970, their number of foggy days has decreased by 30%. And that trend has sort of continued northward into Oregon as well. And so this idea of summer drought is really the sort of major agent that we're thinking about when we think about how forests are going to change. And when we think about disturbance, if we go back to some of the natural native disturbances that we have here, how is climate change going to affect some of these biotic disturbances? And it's really, really complex to project and predict because there's a diversity of organisms out there and they have very, very different life histories and stages and will potentially react to climate change in very different ways. But what we can do is think about these in different ways. And the first thing we know is how is climate change going to affect host species? So in terms of Douglas fir beetle, how do climate change effects and drought, how are they going to affect Douglas fir? And we know they're going to be hotter and drier and that Douglas fir are going to be more drought stressed. And so it's logical to say that Douglas fir beetle is likely going to play a bigger role and become a more effective threat. And then the second question we can think about is how is climate change going to affect the life cycle of individual disturbance agents? And this here is sort of this classic example of mountain pine beetle, which we don't really have in the Coast Range. But what folks have seen in the Pacific Northwest and the Rockies and really up into British Columbia is that longer, warmer growing seasons have allowed mountain pine beetle to expand because now it's not only having one brood per year, it's having potentially 2. And so it's repeating its life cycle twice on an annual basis. And that's had really, really large effects. How that's going to affect Douglas fir beetle, we don't know. We think about things like Swiss needlecast, and certainly warmer, wetter springs could make Swiss needlecast worse, whereas drier later summers and more drought may actually reduce Swiss needlecast. It's tough to say. Trees will be more stressed, but what the effects of that drought on the actual agent are really, really tough to predict. Thinking in terms of fire, there's tons of studies out there that project future fire, and what these do is they take statistical models, and so they look back to the record. We have good records going back to about the 1980s, and they look at how the climate is related to area burned. And then they use climate change projections to try and predict how things are going to change into the future. And one of the problems for the Coast Range is that we haven't had a ton of fire to train these models on since then. And the other big thing is that these models are not sensitive to those dry east wind events. And so there's a lot of uncertainty there. And we don't know yet how climate change is going to change those dry east wind events. But we do know that the climate is going to get warmer and drier during fire season. Potentially, we're going to lose some of that fog. And potentially, we have anthropogenic ignitions as a greater threat. And so of all these studies, their projections vary, but the thing that they have in common is that we can expect more fire. The magnitude of that is uncertain, but it's likely that we are going to see more fire, particularly here on the west side. Another thing, not specifically necessarily associated with climate change, but invasive species. They're just another stressor that are out there, and they're pervasive, even across non-forest systems. They're usually associated with disturbance, roads, clear cuts, things like that. They're prevalent across the Coast Range, all vegetation types. They're a real threat in special habitats, things like meadows, certainly dunes, European beach grass. And one thing of specific concern, pyrogenic shrubs, specifically gorse. This was one of the main drivers of that 1936 fire in Bandon that I mentioned. And the Southern Oregon Gorse Project, I got what I think is a really, really scary picture of a landscape down there. And you can see that there's just this huge patch of abandoned land that is dominated by gorse. And if you can think about what would happen, it's a very, very flammable species that had oils and things like that. And it can affect not only fire severity, but fire behavior. And so even in the absence of a wind event, that is a very flammable landscape and something to be concerned about. And so in terms of boiling things down, we're going to talk about some of the major vulnerabilities to wrap it up. We still think that Douglas fir will be a dominant species. It has been for thousands of years. Potentially one of the biggest transitions we'll see is more hardwoods, things like oak, potentially, species that are more common to the south in the Klamath, like tan oak. Chinkapin is somewhat occurs out there, big leaf maple, potentially madrone. Those sorts of things are likely to start increasing, especially with things like fire. We're likely to see declines in some of the more shade tolerant late cereal species, things like western hemlock and western red cedar that are not as drought tolerant. Those have become more common over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years as the climate has gotten wetter, but are likely to do less well under more droughty conditions. Along the coast, Sitka spruce is going to be very dependent on that coastal fog belt and what happens there. One of the important things to also consider is climate refugia. The Coast Range is very, very topographically complex. And here I have a figure from Chris Daly, who's a climate researcher at Oregon State. This is a figure from the H.J. Andrews in the Oregon Cascades, but it shows how much within a landscape these temperature gradients can vary. So you get down in some of these dense old growth forests in ravines and things like that. And it is much cooler and moister than it is up on the drier ridges and things like that. And so when we talk about climate change and look at climate change projections, they're usually these really, really coarse gridded cells. And so within those cells, there's potential to be a lot of variability, and topography will play a big role of that. And again, I think we can sort of expect an increase in mixed forests in terms of more hardwoods, particularly inland and away from the coast. And in conclusion, let's see. Oh, yeah. In conclusion, some of these major vulnerabilities: loss of fog on Mary's Peak, really concerned about the recluse climate space for noble fir. Swiss needle casts near the coast, particularly in those younger plantations. We don't know what's going to happen with winter wind, but we're looking into it. That could be a major driver of change, potentially that's going to interact with Douglas fir beetle that would be worse under more intense drought. Large high severity wildfires, and again, non-native invasive species. Some of the major vulnerabilities for these special habitats within riparias, certainly rain events, landslides, and windrow. Meadows, tree encroachment, things like Mary's Peak. If you've been up there, they're actively removing conifers from there because things have been encroaching over time. Invasive species, reburns, fires, and things like that could be beneficial for some of those non-forested types, with the caveat that non-native species are also likely to move in following those sorts of things. Tidal marshes and anything coastal, rising seas and storm surges are a major concern. Those communities have no place to go. And then finally, in dunes, invasive species, Ammophila, European beach grass, really, really common. This is probably more of an issue down to the south. It has the implications to potentially change dune dynamics over time. And I think I've just sort of covered these. And we'll maybe just leave them up for discussion or questions. And I think that's about all I have for now. So if there are questions, I'd be more than happy to entertain them. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was really great information. So if you've got questions, I just encourage you to add them to the Q&A and the chat. But I will kick it off, Matt. I always like to ask kind of what was your inspiration or aha moment to kind of go in a little bit deeper study into this field?
Well, let's see. Honestly, I just wanted to spend as much time in the woods as I could. And I got sort of hooked on disturbance research, actually working in old growth swamps in South Carolina, looking at wind disturbance. And, you know, initially when I went to college to study forestry, my parents were like, oh, you're going to be a forest ranger, huh? And, you know, obviously I think climate change has it's made my work more important. It's changed context for everything that forest ecologists do now. It sets the stage for everything. And you know, COVID has been a hard time, but those 2020 fires on the west side was a really hard time. It was a real wake-up call that those things are a reality. And yeah, I spent a couple of years in California down in Arcata doing a postdoc, and the impacts of climate change in California are really, really visible. The Pacific Northwest, specifically on the west side, has the effects have been somewhat muted. We haven't quite seen them, but yeah, I think climate change, and it's all very real. I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, and I think it really does have an impact when you can physically see something and realize the change that it had. I think it was September of 2020. I didn't notice it on any of your stuff, but there was a crazy windstorm that came through the Cape Perpetua area. And I have no idea what the winds were, but up like on the Discovery Trail, there's just trees down everywhere. And when you walk the trail, you really can understand our size and scope to these trees, but how much it affected like just that area. Even you continue down into other trails and you just don't notice it as much. So yeah. It was just like a explosion, like, wow, you know, this really happens.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you know, I talked about topography and winter winds, and they generally come off the ocean and they're associated with rainstorms. And because they are fairly frequent and chronic, they do a little bit of trimming up, right? Yes. You know, and so they knock things up when things are more variable. But when you get those windstorms from the east that are very, very rare,
Yeah.
I've sort of been in that the Cummins Creek area,
Yep.
in one of those ravines, just some of the big Sitka spruce that
Oh,
snap. Those are big old trees. They've withstood a lot.
yeah. Yeah. It
And
was just
so
fascinating.
yeah,
You
yeah.
really physically see something and you're like, okay, it really sinks in a bit more. What can people do, or what small steps can folks do to help with climate change, and or like during the times of when we're getting more wet springs or more dry and hot falls?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of climate change, it's tough at the individual level, and certainly we can all work on reducing our carbon footprint. That's something we
Right.
can do. And I think in terms of immediate things, I think of the fire concern and just being really, really careful with fires. I showed you that graph about that window
Yeah.
vulnerability. Labor Day, it's sort of the end of the summer and it's a great time for cookouts, but it's also that dry east wind season.
Hmm.
And maybe we should save those celebrations for a month later till after the rains start. But watching ignition is huge. There's a lot of talk about how can the Forest Service or how can forest managers mitigate fire, and we can't. When those dry east winds happen, the only thing that you can do is be prepared to go, right? And so
Hmm.
minimize ignitions. The Forest Service, there's some recent publications looking at road evacuations and which places in the region are more vulnerable to those. But you need to think about those fires like y'all think about tsunamis and things like that.
Right.
It's time to go, and there's a lot of scary stories, and thinning and things like that. The adaptation strategies that we have on the east side, they can be effective over there, reducing fuels and
Hmm.
things like that. But on the west side, there's some of the most productive forests in the world, and you can do a lot of thinning, but it's going to grow back very, very quickly. And it's probably not going to be effective when those dry east winds blow. So, yeah,
Wow.
we talk a lot about community preparedness, and
Yeah.
being able to prevent fires before they start.
Yeah, absolutely. So information ahead of time, keeping that kind of top of mind, especially during those top seasons.
Yeah.
Can you speak about our fragmented landscape, loss of interior forest condition, and connectivity?
Sure. Let's see. I'm gonna take a chance here. I actually had a slide, and I'm not sure if it's still in my
Yep, we can still see it.
Rolodex here.
Okay.
Um, let's see if I can. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So this is a map of current structure in sort of the Siuslaw. This would be sort of the southern part. And what you can see is that we have these two major ownerships, right? We have federal lands, which is BLM towards the interior and the Siuslaw, and then really a lot of private lands. And of course, the dominant practices are short rotation clear cutting on private lands. And certainly if you're a late cereal species like a spotted owl or a marbled murrelet, those do not provide a lot of habitat for you. The lack of old growth in the Coast Range is actually not only the result of logging, but also of those early 20th century fires. And so a lot of it actually burned up before it was able to be logged. And with the Northwest Forest Plan, you can see here, there's actually a lot of dark blue on those federal lands. The Cummins Creek has fantastic old growth. A lot of that date back to the 1850s. But they're not doing a lot of management on federal lands. And so old growth forests are sort of becoming more common and slightly more connected. They are perforated, right? There are these patches of private lands and things like that. But yeah, connectivity, whether or not the Cummins Creek Wilderness Area is functional habitat for a species that needs a large range is really, really questionable. I'm trying to think, the Elliott State Forest, if you go, geez, I can't remember if the Elliott is north or south, but at some point, there is not a lot of old growth forest as you go north till you get to the Olympic Peninsula and the Olympic National Forest. And there are huge gaps for these late cereal species like marbled murrelet and things like that. And so at landscape scales, parts of the Coast Range are recovering and developing more old growth because of the Northwest Forest Plan and because we haven't had many large fires recently. And if you zoom way out to a regional scale, actually recruitment of mature and late successional forests in the Coast Range is offsetting some of the losses that we're seeing to fire in the Oregon Cascades. So there's really multiple scales you can look at that question. Unfortunately, the connectivity and abundance of old growth forests is really, really constrained by patterns of ownership in the Coast Range. So,
got it.
yeah.
What effects do tree farms, which is what logging operations create, loss of diversity, have on the environment and animals living there?
Well, there's two ways you can look at that, right? If you're an old growth species, clear cuts and young forests and fires are not what you need. And you know, I have my own thoughts and things like that about how private lands are managed. But you know, short rotations, or you sort of you simplify forest structure and habitat, right? But it's interesting, there is evidence that, you know, if there wasn't logging out there, we might not really have any early cereal forest in the Coast Range. And so the structure and the composition of those forests is not what it would be if it was created by fire. There are no snags, there's fewer hardwoods.
Right.
That early cereal period is truncated because things are replanted really quickly. The Oregon Forest Practices Act requires that people have seedlings that are free to go within 5 years. And so that early cereal period is truncated. And probably the species diversity isn't there for things like pollinators and things like that. And so I don't, you know, I try to speak as objectively as I can about these issues and talk about the trade-offs. And so, yeah, there are some early cereal benefits that those plantations offer. They are not the ones that fire-created early cereal habitats would have, but society, we can't necessarily have those, right? I mean, as much as we would love to see diverse early cereal habitat, we do not want large fires ripping through the Coast Range these days. So they're very, very complex issues.
Do you expect any long-term effect to our coastal forests from the intense heat bomb last July?
Oh boy, that's an interesting one. That's an interesting one, and is conspicuous as some of that scorch was. I have seen very, very few trees that were actually killed except for in Christmas tree farms. I have not been out to the coast, and I have not seen as much as y'all have living out there. And so potentially it means some bad growth for a year. You know, it could have weakened those trees and allowed some of those biotic disturbances to move in. And it's gonna take some time to see how that plays out. I know from what I've heard, there's a lot of effective topography, you know, and so south-facing aspects really got hit. And some of the places I've seen that are next to roads or open rocky areas, a lot of crown dieback and things like Douglas fir. But I've heard that it's, you know, red cedar, where you might have grand fir, things like that are more susceptible. So, you know, it could be an harbinger of things to come. Again, I try and look at these things from a perspective, and what really amazes me is actually that there wasn't large patches of dead trees, because it was so hot and so far from at least what we know these trees have experienced. So yeah, if anybody out there has observations, I would be really interested to hear if they've seen that scorch has expanded or things like that. But I think y'all have the local knowledge there, and the best I can do is speculate. So.
And I would imagine that's what's happening right now, a lot of speculation, and we'll kind of see it play out as research continues since then over the next several years.
Yeah, yep.
So 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it. So this one kind of links back to the interior patches. They're concerned about protecting the small patches of these interior patches. And can you talk about buffering, connecting those patches?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the secret lies with what happens on private lands. You know, the Forest Service out there in the Siuslaw is probably doing some cutting, but it's primarily probably in old plantations, and it's aimed at accelerating the development of late successional characteristics and things like that. And so all that stuff is constrained really by ownership patterns. And if there's going to be change, it might come through policy shifts. But I don't think there's any reasonable explanation to look, you know, in that area around Highway 20 to expect that we're going to see large chunks of late cereal and old growth forest developing. You know, if I were to talk to private timber companies, I would sort of suggest, you know, diversifying your age structure. You know, managing for bigger trees is potentially one way that you could mitigate future fires. It's not going to save you during a wind event, but some of these smaller fires at bigger trees with thicker bark and higher canopies are less susceptible to mortality. And so depending on how private owners decide to adapt to future climate change and what's going to happen, I think it's really that ownership that's going to constrain things.
And then one more question. If we all acknowledge around 80% plus are human caused, what are some programs that are in play to help reduce that?
Oh, you know, I couldn't tell you specifically. That's a little bit outside of my knowledge base, but I do know that like Oregon State Extension has lots and lots of information about some of those programs. But, you know, frankly, what I would like to see is that if you remember that figure, maybe this is a little too sciencey and nerdy, but that figure showing the frequency of those dry east wind events and the occurrence of those, I would love to see a billboard of that, you know, along Highway 20. And in my mind, you know, just public awareness. People need, we need to know. And 2020 was a wake-up call. And you know, we had those Eagle Creek fires in 2017, and I needed to communicate to managers and the public that those fires were nothing compared to the potential for large wildfires on the west side. And it was a challenge to tell people in Portland that, you know, these fires that they can see along the Columbia River Gorge that scorched really, really large areas and dropped ash in the city on their cars were just sort of a hint of the potential. And I no longer have to do that with those 2020 fires. I think, you know, Kate Brown sort of referred to them as a generational event, and she nailed it. She nailed it. And we have short memories, right? You know, maybe there's great grandparents or grandparents that are around that remember the Tillamook burns, but those 2020 fires will stick in our memories for a long time, and we need to learn from them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to everyone for the really great questions. I know there's probably a couple folks out there that want to probably go a bit deeper with you or may have more questions. So I went ahead and plugged Matthew's email into the chat. So you can copy that, and you can always connect with me too. If you just reply to those emails that you get about the event, that'll come to me and I'll see those and can share his contact info that way as well. So thank you so much again, Matthew. Really appreciate you jumping online with us this Saturday morning. I wish everybody a wonderful weekend. I know it's sunny right now here in Walport, Oregon, and we're slated for a nice weekend. So I hope you all enjoy it wherever you are at. With that, goodbye and have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Take care.